Welcome to the Veterinary Rehabilitation Podcast, where we aim to help fellow veterinary rehab therapists increase their knowledge and elevate their practice. I'm Megan Kelly.
And I'm Anae Lloyd. Together, we bring you the latest insights, research, and information in the field of veterinary rehabilitation.
This podcast is brought to you by Onlinepethealth, a leading continuing education membership for veterinary rehabilitation therapists. With Onlinepethealth, you'll have access to a wide range of online resources to help you stay up to date with the latest techniques, advances, and trends in the industry.
Our podcast features in-depth conversations with leading experts in veterinary rehabilitation. They share their own experiences and knowledge to help you improve your practice. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting out in the field, our goal is to provide you with the tools and the insights you need to succeed.
So join us as we explore the exciting world of veterinary rehabilitation and help you take your practice to the next level. Hey vet rehabbers, today's episode takes us to a Facebook Live session in our Small Animal Vet Rehabbers, where I had the pleasure of chatting with Lauren Hunt about demystifying laser parameters. Now, for some of us, understanding the laser strengths and all the parameters that come with it comes so naturally, but for others, myself included, it can feel a little bit overwhelming. Lauren does such an amazing job of breaking down these complexities into simple, easy to understand concepts. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. Now, if you're looking for some free online learning, we have got you covered. Alongside our membership, which includes over 500 hours now of vet rehab specific content for equine, small animals, and hydrotherapy, we also offer our free webinars through our limited access membership. The latest updates include the biomechanics of agility by Ariel Pichette-Markley, capitalizing on canine cognition during hydrotherapy with Ansi van der Walt, and returning the equine athletes to work after injury with Lee Clark. If you're interested, you can go to onlinepethealth.com/free to get access to any of these webinars. A quick word from our sponsor. Nada first developed her courses at the Colorado State University, where she started the Medical Acupuncture for Veterinarian Certificate program in 1998. In so doing, Dr. Robinson developed a science-based platform for veterinary acupuncture, the first of its kind. Today, Curacao Vet offers a comprehensive curriculum in integrative medicine with a rational, evidence-supported foundation. Courses include medical acupuncture, photomedicine, botanical medicine, medical massage, and integrative rehabilitation. You can discover Curacao Vet at curacao.org. All right, over to my chat with Lauren. Hey, Lauren, thank you so much for joining me. Hey, everyone, how you doing? Lauren, won't you tell the people that are here to listen to all the things about laser, a little bit about yourself, and how you became so passionate about all things laser?
Yeah, so hi everyone. Thanks so much for having me, first of all. It's really lovely to be here. So I suppose, I'm Lauren. I am a veterinary physiotherapist in the UK. I went to, it's now called ARU, so Angela Ruskin University, the Writtle campus, but it was called Writtle University College back when I went to it. We've recently merged. And I did my master's degree, integrated master's in veterinary physiotherapy. And as I was going through that, we had to pick up a dissertation topic, and there was loads of different things that I found really interesting. I started very equine, and then I seem to have shifted very canine. I sort of dance in between. But a lot of modules, we'd come across elements where there were these just big gaps in knowledge. And as I'm sure you guys can appreciate, you're filling a lot of those gaps, which is fantastic. But it kept coming back to this select therapy sort of area, and I kept finding that quite interesting, which is hilarious because I did triple science at school. I've always been a bit of a nerd and love science, but the bit I have issue with is the physics. And so I typically went, electrotherapies, and got into the most physicsy part of it I could. But there was a lot of areas where our lecturers would just happen to go, well, anecdotally this, and there's a little bit of research here, and we don't really know that. And I thought, I want to know. I'm one of those annoying people that I want to work it out. I want to know. Laser was one of the trickier topics. Everyone found it a bit harder to get their head around. There's so much involved with it. And for me, I'm like a bit of a dog with a bone like that. I'm like, nope, I want to work out what this is, what's involved with it. So I chose it as my undergrad systematic review, did a big sweeping sort of scope of the research, found out, there's really not enough to known on horses and dogs specifically. We were taking a lot of information from rats and rabbits and mainly humans. So I was like, that's not on. We need to find out these answers. We want to know how to use it. And so then I took it forward into my fourth year dissertation as well, to be honest, because I think it's just one of the very many great modalities we've got in our toolbox to try and help our cases, and the animals seem to really enjoy it. I think it was when I was doing time in clinical practice as well, while a student and after, you could see that some animals that maybe you couldn't get very hands-on with straight away, or a bit sort of standoffish, maybe nervous, you could use some of these other modalities to maybe try and take the edge off for them and let them know you're not a vet, you're there to help. And it seemed to work really nicely. So yeah, the passion from it just grew from there. And then I think because I was the one that then liked this topic and understood it, friends on the course were like, great, teach me laser, do this. So I got quite used to talking about it quite a lot. And then, yeah, thankfully, opportunities from there have just kept coming up, and here I am, I suppose.
Well, I must say, you always, whenever I listen to you, because for the Online Pet Health members, we've actually got 2 of Lauren's webinars in the membership. So I'm just going to say what they are, and I watched both of them. Photobiomodulation, understanding important parameters and application considerations. And there's also another great one on photobiomodulations and its use in performance enhancements and recovery. And, when I listen to your lectures, I'm always like, how does she make it sound so simple? Because for me, I'm one of these kind of people that feels really overwhelmed by lasers, like how to work everything out. And to the degree that actually sometimes it actually scares me a little bit, because I just can't get my head around everything. So I want to say thank you for those lectures, because they really did help me. But I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that also have the same feeling that I had before I watched your lectures, where there's just a little bit of overwhelm, because there is so much, right? I mean, there's all these things to consider, like the different types of lasers and the wavelengths and, like how many joules and all of these things. So what advice can you give to those people that are just a little bit nervous to get going with it?
Yeah, and like you say, completely. I'm so glad that I make it sound simple, because I panic that I'm like, oh, I'm taking it too basic. What am I doing? But like you say, if it comes out useful, then amazing, fantastic, brilliant. That's exactly what I would love to have. So I think for me is, if you've really not, because again, from teaching at a few different universities across the country now, and sort of going to speak to past students of different courses, the level of education is a little bit different where you go, isn't it? So either you've got someone like me that drones on about the poor students at ARU Writtle now, where I go on and on about all these therapies. It's a big part of our curriculum, whereas other times it's just touched on. So you might come out with varying knowledge, and if you've someone that it's sort of come out as it's definitely sort of increased in popularity, hasn't it? So if you're now thinking, oh, do I need to get involved in this world? How could I step into it? For me, I think doing your own research would be fantastic. So I always like to say, if you know how it works, then you'll understand a lot of the other elements as well. So I think sort of a two-parter is know yourself how it works. Don't go straight to a company because you're just trusting them. And there's some amazing companies out there, but there's some also less educated companies out there. As we know, there's lots of sort of cheaper products out there that are potentially less safe and less effective. So I think if you have a bit of a baseline to sort of search for some CPD on a platform such as Onlinepethealth, have a basic working knowledge of what the modality is, what it's using, so in this case light, how it does that, then you can start to have an opinion on what it's safe to use on, what it's not, as well as try and ask loads of companies. So don't go to one company and ask them questions. Ask the same question to every company you can find. Companies that other therapists might recommend. And my sort of green flag, if you like, as soon as I talk to a company, is if I go, so how does it work? Or what are you basing your machine on? If they can bring out a big sort of roll of paper that sort of goes down the stairs and winds around the house a few times of all these research papers and the people they've worked with in the field, evidence-based practice that they've based their machine on, then you can trust where they're coming from, basically. And like I say, if you've got a bit of a working knowledge of the cellular mechanism yourself, if they start saying things and you're thinking, yeah, that all sounds really familiar, then that's, again, a good sign that you could trust where they're coming from. And then you can start to trust them as an educational platform as well. Because I think so many times as vet physios, we're sort of expected to be experts in everything. And you think, actually, we've got a good working knowledge in most things, but there's pockets that we're much more familiar with. So having companies out there that don't just sell us products, but also give you follow-up aftercare. You want the companies that check in with you, say, is it working? So you can be the one to go, actually, I'm not getting the results that I would have hoped for. And they can go, if you've got people saying, how are you using it? What are you doing? What this? Okay, change this, change that. You want those people on your side to sort of have that aftercare run through and any updates in the information as well.
I love it. That's really, really great advice. Thank you. Lauren, what is one of the things that we forget when we're considering parameters?
So this is a bit, I sort of have two answers for this as well. This is where I go off. So a really common thing that people will think about parameter wise are your wavelengths, your joules, and your power. I'd say they're the top three that people sort of come back to. If you've got a little bit more experience, or if you've been taught it, then you might also include the frequency there, sort of the pulse rates and things like that. So I think they're the top 3 or 4 that, if you're new to laser, I'd say definitely get familiar with. I'd say that's a good aim to have, is understanding what they are, the differences, and how they play a part. But for the people that are more familiar with it, I think elements of sort of like those many other parameters that we talk about that it gets a bit confusing is the aperture. So a lot of different laser devices, the actual size of the diode that they've got in the head and how big the beam comes out of that. So the size of, if you shone it across the room and it made a little red dot on the wall, the size of that dot. Because that can be quite important sometimes in some of the more powerful devices. They're deliberately bigger to sort of spread that energy over a larger area, so to try and minimize some heat aspects. And some are really, really small, and you might want to actually take that into consideration, because there's also the aperture of the individual diode, but also we can sometimes use single diodes where we've got one little applicator with one little light in the end. So it's really good for focal, like sort of around joints and maybe like dead on a trigger point, that sort of thing. Whereas you've also got the cluster heads, and especially in the equine world, you can get some really big cluster heads to be able to try and treat some larger muscle group areas. So bearing that in mind, of actually considering that in your dosing. So if you've got a machine where you have to calculate the dose, you're going to want to count how many little lights you've got in your head to actually times it up by that many as well, or you might be really overdosing and underdosing and things based on that. Knowing if you've got LEDs or actual laser diodes in the head as well. So sort of really knowing your machine is really key. Some of them have a mixture. Some of them have all one or the other. If you've got all laser diodes, there's normally an LED there in some respect of a red wavelength, so that we can visually see that it's on. So if you're looking at your diode and thinking they all look the same except that one, it might be more of a safety aspect of, because if you're using the near infrared wavelengths, we can't actually see them. It starts to come out of the visible light spectrum. So often there's a little safety light there, so you can actually see that it's on. And again, sort of staying down the more technical route, I guess, is actually calculating your dosages for depth as well. So there's loads of calculations out there. There's loads of elements that need calculating. Again, you would hope that if you've bought a laser, it would come with a book, some sort of user manual that's showing if you need to calculate how to do it and the steps involved. Or you've got a fancy machine that calculates it for you, but it's still good to sometimes run some of these calculations and understand the theory behind it, because depending again on the machine, if you've got quite a simplistic one, which is nothing wrong with those, you might actually have the benefit of being able to calculate your own dose, because there's formulas out there, which the formulas themselves are quite easy. I think it's understanding what to put in the formula is the really difficult thing. But we can also calculate for depth now. So you're calculating the surface dose to give, but trying to give enough energy that we're targeting the tissue depth that we might be trying to target. So if you're more like joints and deeper muscles and things like that. The other side of things, I think we always get really bogged down in those laser parameters. Like you say, it's a really overwhelming area. People go, I've got to know, like Lauren's just listed those 4 and then another 2 and then that, and what does that mean? But I think also the parameters involved in using the laser. So just how frequently are you going to use the laser? How are you going to adapt the dose for that specific case in front of you? Because I think we sort of sit there and think, right, okay, research, that's the dose that I apply for a trigger point in the back. But that needs to be different if you're treating a very thick-haired, very dark-coated horse versus a very light-coated, very thin, maybe skinned, very light-coated greyhound or something, or a much smaller animal. I've got clients that treat like rabbits and things, and they've got much different anatomy and sort of skin thickness in areas and things like that. So I think really, even if you've just got that wavelength, power, frequency and joules sort of in your head without worrying about the other really technical parameters, just knowing how to kind of alter them to suit your needs. Because I think half the time that's why we find that laser doesn't work, or it's not as effective as we want it to, or anything like that, is because you might not be sort of ramping your dose up or down dependent on the animal you've got in front of you. Because one, as we know, one thing doesn't treat everything. We need to twist it. And I think I go into more detail in the webinar. I'm just bookmarking off to my webinars now, but I sort of give some examples in that of what to raise up and down when for what sort of elements, because there's loads of things involved, like the tissue type that I'm treating, how chronic the case is, coat color, coat length, skin color, like the sheer size of what you're treating is just a few of the ones to bear in mind.
You were explaining about some of the laser machines that had like those settings where basically, you can put in the size of the dog or whatever, what animal it is, and then they can basically give you exactly what all the parameters should be, versus one where you're actually doing it yourself. What would you recommend? I mean, obviously for somebody who's just starting out, having the ability to be able to get the parameters and get everything set for you is great. But there are some limitations to that. What would you recommend somebody starting out with? What type of laser they should get? Something where they can get help, or one where they actually learn the right way and work it out themselves?
Yeah, that's tricky, isn't it? Because I suppose it depends on the sort of person you are. If you're happy to sit with something, kind of noodle it around and really teach yourself, then this is what I preach to the students that I teach all the time, is take a problem and try and work with it, because you'll learn much better from that. And I think that's quite giving as well. Although, whereas I like that approach, I do understand that there's that sort of imposter syndrome element, isn't there? But have I taught myself right? Where's the guarantee that I've got this correct? So I suppose potentially a bit of both is always the best answer, isn't it? It's a great idea. There are some sort of resources and things out there. So there's laseruniversity.co.uk, I believe, or .org. But there's some websites out there where it's sort of, you register access. And so if you are the person that's maybe got a device that you've had to self-tell, you've sort of worked it out yourself, you can go on webinar platforms like this, websites such as that, and kind of compare, like, what are you doing compared to everyone else? So are you sort of looking up research papers and sort of using the joules out of those and using them in your practice? Fantastic. Whereas, like you say, there are companies out there that, if they're good companies and they really invest in laser and they want you to do well with it, they should still be happy to sort of reach out, at least into some respect, and reassure you that you're getting it right and how to use lasers in the first place. So yeah, I think it's dependent on who you are as a person. But if you have no idea about laser, I would definitely maybe go to a company, at least get the basics. And there's some companies out there that do just run a basics in understanding laser. So yes, it will probably be more focused on their laser. But again, if it's a training course, kind of your green flag is that they talk about general mechanism, general laser. Your red flag is, yeah, our laser this, our laser that, it fixes everything, because we know it doesn't fix everything. And there's times that you shouldn't use it and that other things are better. So
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the laser companies, the reputable ones, are very invested in educating. So I think if you go to a lot of the major websites, you'll be able to get loads and loads of information. And
yeah, there's loads of like recorded webinars and all
Yeah.
sorts on free access. So it's fantastic.
And if you do buy a laser, I think one of the things you said, makes me think the company should be invested in you. So if you're having problems or you need advice, they should have somebody that you can reach out to. A lot of these companies don't have someone in-house, but they might have a veterinary physiotherapist that is a consultant to them, and you could reach out to that person and say, hey, I need a little bit of help here.
Yeah, definitely. Don't be shy, because again, they would much rather you shout about their laser because it's really working on everything and find it really effective and you love it, because they want you to shout about that in veterinary physio circles, because then the good lasers should shine through, as opposed to the ones where you go, I couldn't get an answer about this, I couldn't that. And don't be afraid to ask for a webinar talk as well. Like, the one gift COVID has given us, if any, is that we're all quite good at meeting online and speaking online and turning the camera on and getting that sort of face to face at a distance, like you say. So it might be someone on the other side of the world to you, but trying not to just, if they write this email of just formulas and God knows what, and you look at it and go, nope, don't be afraid to say, actually, could there be a bit more help? Have you got a webinar pre-recorded that you could send me, or could we sit down and work this out? Because it might even be that there's a few therapists that you know in your area that all want the same support, and they'd be more than happy half the time to set up sort of almost like a mini session for a few members, the companies that I've worked with anyway.
So pulsing is another parameter. So, and then just to confuse us, there's like continuous and there's pulsed and then there's super pulsed. So won't you explain all of that and when you would use that?
Super. Just the list keeps going on. Yeah, so continuous is the easiest one to start with. And I always liken this to just like a light switch. So if you turned your laser on and it was a continuous laser, it's just on. You switch the light on, the laser is being emitted the whole time. It just stays on until you switch it off. That one's quite fine and easy to get your head around. Pulsed lasers and the super pulsed basically just do the same as pulsed, but really quickly. So sometimes it's no good you sort of trying to turn your laser on and visually see if it's pulsed or super pulsed, because normally they're flashing so quickly you can barely detect it. You might see it flickering ever so slightly. Obviously at the slower pulse rates you might notice if it's a really slow one. But yeah, so pulsed means how many times it's turning on and off. So if I had my bedroom light and I was flicking it on for a second, off for a second, on for a second, off for a second, that would be a very slow pulsed laser. But that's essentially what it's doing. And we can do that very quickly. So it can be higher pulse rate settings, where if you were like flicking the switch really quickly on and off, you might see this flicker, but the light itself is the laser beams being emitted and then stopping. But very similar to sort of like our pulse ratios and things in ultrasound. Similar thing, but it's with the lights turning on and off or not. But within that pulse, if you look at some of the research, and in my webinar, there's some better graphics I almost need like a little flip chart. There's some better graphics in the webinar of there's different elements of the pulse itself. So there's when it turns on or off. So you'll have a bar switch it on and then the bar will switch off, like on a graph, if you like. But then you've got how many times it maybe turns on. So you've got like pulse chains of it goes on, off, and it stops for a bit. And then it repeats it and then stops and repeats. You've got how long it's on for, how long it's off for, because it could be on, off, or it could be on, off. I'm just going to keep doing this on the screen now and hope it makes sense. So there's lots of different parameters within the pulsing itself. And that's something that you'd have to ask, like your laser would be built with that. So that kind of links into what you were saying before about knowing what device to buy and sort of things like that. Is a lot of these parameters will actually be almost preset in the device you buy. The device you buy will have a wavelength or maybe a few wavelengths that it can emit. You can't turn that up or down. It's the parameter that it physically emits, and pulsing is kind of one of those things. Sometimes you can change the pulse rate. So if it's capable of being pulsed, we could maybe pulse it faster or slower. But again, that's the more complicated machines. The simplistic ones, they might have maybe 2 or 3 set pulse rates that you can choose from. And so, like I say, super pulsed is a bit of a change in the physical making of the device. There's different gases and things that they've put in the chamber to create the wavelength itself. But it can do that very, very quickly with the switching the light on and off. And there's different benefits of it as well. So the rough school of thought, which I'll always say the general school of thought, because we need more research in this area, is going to be a repeated theme there, is that continuous just being on all the time. It's been shown, and at least anecdotally in my practice as well, animals with darker coats, they seem to absorb that light a lot faster, and they seem to, some animals can sort of, it's not always heat. There's the heat element to it of your doses. So if that was your skin and you was applying the laser to it, it can accumulate and saturate the skin faster, and so they can react to it. If you are using a high power, it can be the heat. But I've seen it with very low power lasers as well, and they can just the cells in the body that absorb the light that are coming out and the energy can just get saturated quite quickly. So they've shown that the pulse, as soon as, if I have an animal that does that, as soon as I flick it to a pulse setting, or if I had it on a low pulse setting, if I turned it higher, they don't seem to do it at all. They seem to really relax. There's no fasciculation, there's no twitch there, and they seem to be much more comfortable with the dose. So there's the thought that by switching that light on and off really rapidly, it gives those cells a moment of being blasted with that energy, that light, and then sort of almost a little recovery phase, and then same thing again. So we know that certain cells as well can have different cellular reactions to different pulse rates. And again, I referenced some of that research in the webinar. So fibroblasts seem to like one pulse rate, whereas nerve regeneration, like nerve cells, seem to like different lower pulse rates and things like that. So there's, again, getting into the technical part, there's sort of various reasons you might up and down your pulse rate. But as a basic thing, I'd say my darker coats, my more chronic painful conditions, I tend to use a higher pulse rate, but not always. I always bring it back to what that animal right there in front of me is showing me, whether they're enjoying it or not.
And so you said you'll have those cases where they're like fasciculating, or you can just see they're uncomfortable, and in those ones you would increase the pulse rate. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I've always sort of checked everything. So there's that first little, am I doing anything wrong? What's happening here? Have I not assessed fully? So you go back in with your palpation, check their behavior, check nothing else is upsetting them. Sometimes it's with special electrotherapies, it's as simple as you're concentrating so much that you haven't noticed that whatever cable is draped between you and a machine is just tickling them. Especially on the horses, they're twitching away and you're like, what am I doing? I'm doing something wrong. It was quite funny. It was a police dog that I was treating, and I was actually using the Indiba, and it was the first time I'd used it, so I was being very careful and looking. And this dog's leg kept twitching, his foot kept like sort of, and I was going, oh God, like the heat, the this, like stop, checking everything, I'm doing it right. And it was just my ponytail was literally tickling his paw, and I was like, oh God. So I'd first of all check all those things, but yeah, when I've checked all of that and I know everything's fine, I've simply just either, if I've got a machine that I can turn, if it was on continuous, I will turn it up at least somewhat to a pulse setting, often as high as I can with the dark coated animals, and it does seem to resolve it. Potentially your application technique as well. So if I'm using the lower classes, you can stay static. It might be that I'll do static, pause it, give them a second, maybe a bit of effleurage through, and then go back again. Because again, something we should always be doing is not just turn the machine on, let it do its thing, not question it, assess before, assess after, assess in between every treatment you give, because if we've resolved that trigger point, I don't need that energy, and then potentially we can go in with other techniques.
One more question about the pulse. So it doesn't at all affect the penetration. So the penetration is exactly the same. It's just that it's, the laser's going and then it's off, and then it's going, then it's off. So penetration is exactly the same no matter what pulse you do.
That's an area that I haven't found enough research in to give a really clear, objective answer. We definitely seem to think that penetration helps, but how much it helps, not sure. So your depth of penetration is more coming from the specific wavelength that you have, which is why often there's a mixture of wavelengths in these devices. So the red wavelengths are absorbed much more superficially, and the sort of the very higher ends near infrared wavelengths are going to get deeper into the tissue. There's a thought that, so it's not about maybe how, if you had maybe two infrared wavelengths and they both get, say, that deep into the skin. This is very rudimentary. Don't measure my hands and quote that it's so many centimeters. This is just an example. But say they both, say a continuous near infrared wavelength got this far. If you pulsed it, there's the thought that more of the energy could be absorbed at a lower depth. So the penetration itself is the same between the two wavelengths, but are you going to be saturating the skin less at the surface level to allow more of it to get through? But like, again, liking it to other electrodes, or ultrasound, where we have the 3 and the 1 megahertz, they get to the same depth, but more energy is absorbed at different depths. So I think that is the school of thought, that pulsing can try and help the energy get where it's going to get, but it can't sort of enhance it any further than it already can just get. We know that the one problem with laser is getting it down to the area that we need it. Annoyingly, it can do all these great things, but how do we get it there? But there's ways around that.
All right, let's chat about wavelengths. So what are the wavelengths you want to look for in a laser, and when would we use the different wavelengths?
So I suppose I've nipped into this a little bit, as that's the thing with all these parameters, we teach them separately. But it's like for me, it's like when I teach water management, they sort of teach, this is chlorine, this is this is that. Be like, but they're all in the water at the same time together, mixing round. And it's the same with these. The wavelength you choose will affect this, will affect that. So the wavelengths, the lower ends, the red ones that we can see, they're going to be more absorbed superficially. So we use them really a lot on wounds. There's actually new research, I say new, fairly new research come out just to complicate the calculations we were mentioning earlier, that they've actually calculated the electron charge, sort of the electron photon energy in the different wavelengths. So you can now incorporate that in your calculations when you're trying to see exactly how many joules are coming out. Yeah, it's a really good paper by Young. I think it's 2020, 2021. It's got a horrible title, which is often what puts people off reading papers on lasers, but when you scroll down into it, it makes more sense. So they've shown that where before maybe we'd do this times that equals this many joules, using the different wavelengths, there's actually more energy in the where you are on electromagnetic spectrum. So the higher we go up into the near infrared, the less energy it actually has as before when you go down. So that's why a lot of the blue wave lights that we use, so if you do a lot of wound healing and using it for that, there's actually some blue wavelengths we use sort of around the 400 sort of bracket, 400 to 500 bracket nanometers. They damage the cell membrane of your bacteria. That's how they sort of have that antimicrobial effect to kill off bacteria. It's because they've got more energy on the electromagnetic spectrum and they're actually more damaging, but they're absorbed really, really superficially, which is why we often have an open wound that's right there. As you turn it up, they get absorbed further down because we're avoiding, if you Google sort of different chromophores and their absorption rates, you'll get this table with all these wiggly lines on it. But you can see that water starts going down as hemoglobin starts coming up. So you basically, a lot of the manufacturers will choose wavelengths that kind of hit those perfect little Goldilocks points, if you like, in between those. So you get water absorbing as least as it as possible, hemoglobin as low as possible. So your cytochrome C oxidized, the chromophore we want to target, has got the best chance possible of getting some of that laser light and absorbing it. So that's why you'll see loads of trends between the different devices of like 810, 904, and those sorts of brackets of light. You go, why are they all using very specific numbers of like 904? And it's because on that graph of all the things that absorb light in our bodies, everything's as low as possible bar the one we're trying to focus on, but trying to get that depth as well. It's like a constant balancing act, if you like. So I suppose the near infrared one's deeper application, which tends to be pain. People say like, oh, you need a high wavelength to kill pain. You don't. It just seems to be that it penetrates that a little bit deeper, so maybe we can get to the things like the nerves and the muscles and things that we're trying to target, whereas the redder wavelengths, the lower ones, tends to be more your wound healing and things like that, which is often why you've normally devices now you buy have got a red and a near infrared at least wavelength to kind of hopefully get best of both worlds.
What should we be looking at, like if we're wanting to buy a laser? What are the things that we should consider?
So for me, again, having a company you really trust that shows their knowledge base. If you're going to go straight to a company and say, what should I buy? Go to loads of companies and ask them to explain their laser to you. If you come away from that really understanding it, they've clearly done a good job. If you come away going, I don't understand that, what was this, what was that, how did that compare, then maybe not as good of a sign. But for me, I think look at your treatment, like your sort of client base. Who will you be treating? Because you get a lot of people say, what's the best laser to buy? What's the best class? You've got this class 3, class 4 debate going on. And you think, for me, there's not one best laser. It's how you use it. And it's knowing the best laser for you. Because you could have 3 different people and you could say, actually, the best laser for you are 3 different things. There's not a best laser. So I think knowing if you treat maybe all small animal and you never see a horse, and so you never want potentially the characteristics involved with that. If you're very maybe acute practice, you're working with vets, you deal with a lot of wounds and infected wounds and things like that, and you're wanting to treat them, you might need a best of everything. You might want a laser that you can, when you look at it, like I said, you don't want one of those devices where there's only maybe a couple of set parameters you can choose for on or off. You might want one of those devices that you can really choose a big spectrum of parameters. So I think they're the sort of things I look for initially. as a general rule, you can create the effects that you want from any class, really. So the whole class system is purely safety. There's no better class, there's no worse class. It doesn't get better as you go up or down. It's safety. It's how much energy that laser can emit. So class 4s are 500 milliwatts and above. There's no cap on that. So my brother's a design engineer. He's working with lasers all the time, not the same ones. They're the ones that will cut through diamonds and all sorts. They're still class 4 lasers. We just use them turned down. Class 3, you've got your little bracket of wavelength, and then lower. So I'm actually lucky that I use some class 2s as well. And for me, I think in different scenarios or different cases, there's benefits to giving that dose over a longer period of time and accumulating the total joules versus getting the joules much quicker. So at a basic level, the class 4s are better at delivering energy faster, because as you look at the calculation, the more power, the more watts that machine emits, the faster it can deliver joules. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, again, research is still trying to tell us. It does seem to be beneficial for pain, because we seem to want to use higher amounts of joules to try and negate that pain. But for example, I didn't use, when I was first practicing, we had a class 3 at the university. We've got a few now, and you can still get pain relieving effects with the other classes. Sometimes better, because there's sometimes some tissues, like animals that have been very chronic for a very long time. It depends on the animal, but you can almost tell, like, there's the animals that are very chronic that are desperate for you to relieve a lot of things, and they unwind very quickly. And then there's the ones that are very tightly wound. And for me, I don't often want to give them, this is anecdotal, but I don't want to give them a very big, very fast joules, because it's sometimes a bit much for them. So actually going in and maybe with a class 2, 3 lower and giving that dose over a longer period of time, treating other elements in between, coming back in again, seems to be much more beneficial. You see them kind of relax a bit better, a bit quicker.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's also quite a big price difference between the class 3 and B and the class 4. And sometimes people decide just on that, like what can I afford? But that's not necessarily the only thing you should be thinking about. Like, you can use a class 3B laser just as effectively. Obviously depends on your cases. And like one thing I think about, for me is like, if you're mobile, the class 3Bs I think are smaller units than the class 4. So it's a lot easier to be able to transport. And obviously the safety factors of the class 4 for me is huge. This class 3B, obviously you sometimes also have to have goggles on and people there, but you've got to be really careful with the class 4 laser. Let's chat about those. Like, let's chat about the safety factors of lasers in general, and then the contraindications.
Yeah. So like you say, massive element of just being able to physically move it around with you is often half. Being able to afford it and being able to move it is realistically the day-to-day problem, isn't it? But I suppose for me, there's certain contras that I just can't move away from. So like you said, wearing goggles, you cannot shine these in eyes, animals, humans, anyone around you. And that is why class 4s are banned to be used in FEI on competition days over here in the UK and that anyway, because you cannot, the class 4s in theory, when you look at the research behind it, all lasers should have the laser warning triangle on them. So again, I suppose another green flag to look at is if your laser device actually comes with the warning symbols that it should have on it. But if you look into the engineering side of the safety classifications, the higher classes should actually be used in rooms that have got blacked out windows that are sort of only certain people allowed in and out, which obviously you cannot replicate out on a mobile yard or in other people's homes. So that links back to your contra of not shining anything in anyone's eyes. So wearing the little goggles, whether you can get your animals to wear the goggles or whether you just make sure they're facing the other way, maybe with a licky mat, far more intent on that than anything else. Or like you can hold, if you are treating higher up around the neck, you can hold sort of like a towel to give them almost like makeshift blinkers and things. But yeah, definitely. But you do hear there's lots of research with the lower classes, so not the class 1s and 2s, of them actually treating eye conditions with lasers and so shining them on. But it's because they're normally LEDs and they're normally a lot lower powered that there can be some emission on there without damage. But that's a very careful area to be moving in, which is probably out of the scope of today. But yeah, anything higher, definitely nothing to do with the eyes. Pregnancy is another one. And again, this is more coming back to, this is why I say understand the mechanism of action, because then a lot of the contras make sense. So pregnancy, number one, the animal's got enough work to do on its own and potentially doesn't need you up regulating or bothering anything in any way. A lot of the time I'll say, right, we'll leave the animal to it. As long as they're happy, healthy, we'll treat them beforehand, and then I'll come back in and treat them after when they're at a stage of they need some help. I sort of get that question a lot with like puppies and things as well. It's like, what will you treat puppies with? And I'm like, if they're happy and healthy, they don't need any treatment. Leave them be until they've grown up. But obviously there's the cases where unfortunate things have happened. But so for pregnancy, if you understand that laser is very stimulatory, you don't want to mess with whatever the body is trying to do. Obviously, it's a complicated, very intense biological process as it is of growing a puppy or a foal or whatever the animal may be. You don't want to potentially laser in that area and get in the way of any of those processes. You don't want to speed anything up because things might happen too quickly. So it's an area where we say if they're pregnant, we leave them well alone. Some people argue that laser's got such a local effect that you might be able to sort of laser other areas. So if you've got a horse, like you could maybe still laser sort of down limbs, neck, things like that. But yeah, so for me, if the animal's pregnant or in the reproductive process at all, so it goes the same for the males in the situation, I steer well clear of them until everyone's finished what they should be doing. And the one that I don't think comes up actually very often is steroid use. This is the one that I sort of mention and people go, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's my top 3 of contras of don't go near it. There's other ones out there that would make me more sort of cautious, I guess, of if they're on a lot of different medications, I make sure that none of them make them, because there's certain medications can make animals a bit photosensitive. If they've got other medical conditions that make them photosensitive, if they've got skin conditions and things, if there's very inflammatory skin condition, I potentially don't want to go in and aggravate that in any way. But yeah, I suppose that's the thought. And then I suppose other cautions to come back to, say like just safety of using laser, is we do know that with the class 4s, there is more power. So there is an element of heat created. So in your application, we know that we keep them moving. You don't need to move really, really quickly. You see some people sort of going, and like lasering really quickly. And then I think actually you're potentially not being so effective because you're not given a chance for the light to get into the tissue, but definitely a nice constant speed and different, depending on, I would move faster the higher power you're using. And the sort of manufacturers of those lasers can give you often make sure you're moving this fast. But being aware of everyone's got a little story of they took the device off the animals, forgot to press pause, and actually started burning holes in bedding and things like that if they've left it on there. So making sure that you're safe if you're clicking the pause button, if you have one on there, or turn the device off when you're not using it. But again, on those dark coated breeds, I would move faster than I would potentially on a light coated breed, and palpate constantly. It's not something that you should feel them literally warm and hot from it, but if you've been doing, maybe you're treating the whole hip area all through the back and something like that, I would keep an eye on actually the diode itself and how hot that's getting. So not so much the tissue with ultrasound, I'm making sure I feel the tissue and the probe, but maybe like just every now and then popping the diode on your hand, just like when you've had PMF devices that you've been on a long time, the pads themselves get warm. Keeping an eye on that sort of side of things. I haven't had it be a massive issue, but as long as you know the speed that you're moving on and you've planned out your treatment, then it's just a consideration to have.
One of the things you mentioned was puppies, and I think the growth plates is obviously a no-go.
Yeah. So I suppose young animals, I suppose anywhere kind of in that pregnancy and then early phase, I suppose a whole bracket round there, I would definitely not be applying laser, just like we know ultrasound's a contra for growth plates. It's often not listed as a specific contra with laser, but again, based on the mechanism of action, you don't want to stimulate those plates to close any earlier than they should. So I tend to steer well clear. Using it maybe like on muscular areas, so over like backs and things like that, I would say potentially more safe, because again, depth penetration, I know I'm not going to get down to like the spine if the stellata growth plate's like fusing there. And I might be treating the tissue, I might be treating sort of lower doses to make sure I can't get there, but definitely I wouldn't be like applying it around joints in young puppies, because yeah, I don't want to mess with anything that should be happening as it should do. There's no need to bother that process.
And then probably another controversial topic is malignancy, because you don't want to be using laser in malignancy, thinking that you might make it worse or spread it, but then there's the other side where the case is like terminal and you're not going to do surgery, and we know that we can help with pain management. So that's, I've had that definitely, when I've been practicing. It's sort of that, like, what do you do? And then you get to a stage where you're like, well, we're not operating, we're not doing anything else. All we're trying to do is manage pain. And I know that laser can actually help with this.
Yeah, that palliative care sort of aspect, definitely. And I think that sort of comes in with the puppy side of things. Like, there's been weird and wonderful things and very traumatic, potentially, sort of rescue cases that you've been called in on, and the vet's gone, look, I know we wouldn't normally, but help. And so you potentially use things more cautiously in those areas. But yeah, so that's why I didn't bring that as the top three. I didn't bring that up because when I teach it, I have what I call like local contras and then general contras. So contra of do not touch the entire animal with that device, because you don't want it to. And like you say, any lump or bump is one of those things, because annoyingly, again, in our practice, you get a lump. If the animal owner doesn't want to potentially aspirate, take to the vet, get that lump checked, then I do explain to owners, like, I now can't use electrotherapies on them for fear that it is something. Again, you could potentially laser elsewhere on that animal. That's kind of that's one of those horrible grey areas where it's kind of up to you as a therapist, because I would argue that if you do know that they have cancer somewhere, how do you know it isn't anywhere else without doing a full body scan? But this goes for everyday life. You've got an animal, there's no lumps or bumps, you think they're completely healthy. We don't know what's under the skin. We know that laser's not going to get that deep down, but then you start getting into a whole circle of really second guessing yourself and going round and round, and you'll never touch an animal with anything ever again. But yeah, obviously massively avoiding the area, and potentially some cancers like your osteosarcomas and things like that we know are particularly nasty. I wouldn't be touching anywhere on that animal with an electrotherapy, let alone laser. Whereas some that, like you say, that palliative care, the poor animal's got cancer somewhere, they can't treat it, but it also is struggling to move because its back and stifles are so arthritic that you can go in for a time being. You can use alternatives. We can use heat packs. We can massage. We can this. You could argue you shouldn't be massaging and cancer patient. But like you say, there are the times that I'll expressly explain the risks to the owner, explain that to the vet, get almost like special consent, because obviously I'll get veterinary consent, but I'll sometimes, if I'm being extra careful, like I'll sort of set up some sort of paperwork that's like, you understand that this isn't a good idea, it's a contra, but we can help with some palliative care. And as long as the vet and the owner are on board, then I will use it. Again, still not on the location, but potentially backs and other areas that they might need that support. That's a whole ethical debate to have, isn't it? Which I refer you to the Vet Rehab Summit.
Last question for you. Obviously there are so many different lasers out there, and there are a lot that are made for humans, but then there are all the ones that are made for veterinary, and different prices and everything, and different in different countries where you can get. So what is your recommendation? Like, what is the difference between the ones that are made for humans and the ones that are made for veterinary? Are they similar, just got a different brand name, or are the veterinary ones actually really specifically made for animals? And is that really where we should be focusing when we're thinking about getting a laser?
So for me, laser is laser. Just like PMF, animal device, it emits that energy, it emits that sort of modality. Laser is laser, PMF is PMF, ultrasound is ultrasound. I think where it comes into play is more, so again, the PMF example would be, we got a lot of loops that we like put our arms in, for example, whereas it's not that practical on animals, or you don't want their leg looped through something if they decide to leave. It's more of a health and safety issue. So we have pads that we can get away from them very quickly. Whereas, so similar in the laser side of things is I see a pro of buying a vet specific laser. Sometimes there's, and again, it depends on the device. If you've got the devices that it will take into account coat color, coat length, size with those sorts of aspects, then I see the benefit of that, especially if you're potentially not equipped with doing those calculations yourself and working it out, which most of us, who wants to do maths if you don't have to, then I see that as a massive benefit. But it's not essential. So like you say, if it emits laser, it emits laser. It will still be beneficial. So I wouldn't say it's a be all and end all. We have to stay in the veterinary field. I think some of the veterinary ones are potentially more powerful, again, to potentially sort of going for the negating the coat and everything. But I think by parting the coat and by changing certain parameters, again, you don't have to have a more powerful laser to treat animals effectively. I've seen that in practice in myself as well as everyone else. So yeah, I would say if you're wanting the simplicity of it doing it for you, then buying a vet specific laser is advantageous, but not essential. It's if it produces laser, it produces laser. So if you're more familiar with using the devices, then any device that you find out there that you can tell is safe and evidence-based, then should be effective.
I think also what we were discussing earlier about getting that support from the company, yes, when it is a veterinary specific one, when we come to them with a case that we've got that we're struggling with, you can't go to the human company and say the same thing because they won't be able to help you. So I think really with that support and feedback, I feel the veterinary ones are definitely better in that regard. Lauren, thank you so much. It's been so awesome chatting to you. And guys, like, if this is something that you've been interested in, you have to go and watch that webinar. Like, this is just a little tip of what Lauren shares in her webinar. So thank you so much. It's been absolutely awesome.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button so you get notified every time I load a new podcast. I'm here every week talking to vet rehab therapists from all over the world about all things vet rehab. A big thanks to our sponsor, Curacore Vet. Their sponsorship allows us to be able to give this podcast to you for free, so please go and check them out at curacore.org. Please also don't forget to bookmark the next Vet Rehab Summit. It's on Saturday the 8th of November in 2025. Come and be a part of the world's largest online veterinary rehabilitation conference created specifically for you, the vet rehabber community. Online Pet Health members, you get VIP complimentary access to the Vet Rehab Summit. For more information about continuing education for vet rehabbers, you can go to onlinepethealth.com.